There's a lot that I've read on Kant, and there's a lot that has been written on Kant. Quite a few people have done it well. My interpretation of Kant is going to be sort of outside of the mainstream interpretation of Kant. If you want to get a mainstream interpretation of Kant, go watch somebody else's videos. But my interpretation of Kant, as you'll see, and my interpretation of his response, which I think is validated by his text, is a bit sort of outside of traditional interpretation. So I'll return to that question. So he says they're always synthetic. In order for him to validate the claim that that mathematical propositions are always synthetic, it has to be that there is some amplitive contribution to a further understanding of the subject within experience. Without that, then you can't say that they're synthetic. So he has to give that account in order for his claim that they're always synthetic to be justifiable, if that made sense. B, mathematical propositions are always a priori, right? And I'll just abbreviate this, mathematical propositions, or, yeah, I'll write it up, M-A-T-H-E-L-E. Mathematical propositions are always a priori. Right? Mathematical propositions are always a priori. The question is, how does it attain its a priori nature? And also, wasn't it just the case that you said that they were synthetic, right? So how is it that mathematical propositions are simultaneously synthetic and a priori? Well, the easy part to understand first is with respect to the nature of mathematical propositions being a priori. Its a priori nature is contingent on this idea of necessity, right? Necessity, the fact that the truth of these propositions are necessarily true, makes the proposition a priori, right? So necessity mandates the proposition's a priori nature, and I probably should have actually cited this. I don't know if I can find it now. Let me see if I can find it. Even working with law. Not obtained. Okay, here it goes. It's at the bottom of page 13, if you're using this book, right? And I should have cited it, and I'll probably amend this, or not, maybe not. But at the bottom of page 13 in the Hackett edition, last paragraph, first of all, we must observe that properly, mathematical propositions are always judgments a priori and not empirical, because they carry with them necessity, which cannot be obtained from experience, right? So this idea of necessity in itself gives credence to the claim that mathematical propositions are a priori, right? We get that necessity from it being a priori. So now he complicates it further, right? In order to be able to talk about it being a priori, it has to be necessary. But in order for us to talk about it always being synthetic, there has to be something in experience that amplifies my understanding of the subject, right? Of the thing being analyzed. So as a philosopher, I would have stopped here. But Kant, he takes it further, right? So he has quite a bit that he has to do in this section on mathematical judgments. All right, let's see how he does it. Okay, so he gives us the example, right? He gives us the example of 7 plus 5 equals 12. And I want to spend some time talking about this. He goes through this analysis really quickly, in like a half a page, maybe a page and a half, tops. And there's a lot packed into this, right? The first thing that we have to recognize is that when we're talking about 7 plus 5 equaling 12, we're looking at 12, the number 12, as the concept. Right? We're looking at it as the concept 12. And I'll return nearing the end of this particular series to addressing sort of the significance of calling it the concept 12, right? Why is he classifying it the concept, right? All right, so he's going to use this as his example, and I'll work through the example slowly so that I can make sense of it. As I said, this section in Kant is, and this is like page 3, right? It's immediately extremely dense. All right, so let's look at the example of 7 plus 5 equaling 12 as a concept. The concept 12, according to Kant, right? This idea of 12, according to Kant, the concept of 12 amplifies the unified concept of both 7 and 5. And what in the world does that mean? what Kant is attempting to say is, if you think of the number 7, right, and you think of the number 5, right, this as sort of a unified concept, 7 and 5, right, this as a unified concept, 7 and 5, for Kant, and I think he's right, I mean, I know he's right, within the summation of 7 and 5, within the idea of 12, you cannot find, right, according to Kant, you cannot find its component parts. When we think of 12, you would say, oh no, well no, right, I have 7, and Kant says this, you know, you count to 7, you say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then we add 5. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, right? That's how I get 12. I get the idea of 7, I get the idea of 5, I unify the idea of 7 and 5, and in unifying the idea of 7 and 5, I come up with this new concept, 12, right? So that 12 is a consequence of the union of 7 and 5. And Kant says we're being very, we're being sloppy in our analysis if we describe this very, very simple sort of arithmetic problem, well, not even problem, this arithmetic in that stance, right? And how exactly does he do this? And here's where I think I can sort of clarify. Arithmetically, right? The sum is only, and this is the next point, right? Point number 4. Arithmetically, the sum is only cognitively possible by our intuition. What does this mean? For Kant, right, the sum, right? So the sum of 7 and 5, right? The sum of 7 and 5. We only arrive sort of at this idea of the sum of these two figures because the attempt to describe 12 as the sum, right, is a consequence of our intuition. Our intuition, even though this is a synthetic, not a synthetic, even though this is an a priori claim, right, mathematical propositions are always a priori, it follows necessarily. Even though it's a priori, so we can understand that part, the synthetic aspect, right, the synthetic aspect, the reason why it's synthetic, the reason why mathematical judgments are always synthetic, is that this summation, the summation is a consequence of our intuition, right? The idea of combining elements, right? The idea of combining these elements to create one new element isn't itself, and this is, you know, this is where I think people are just not getting Kant, and it's not an easy thing to understand. The idea of combining 7 and 5 is not sort of encapsulated within this notion of 12, right? The idea of 12, this union, right, as union, so 12 as union, the idea of 12, the concept of 12 as union, is itself a consequence of our intuition. So that within our mind we've seen 7 things, or we've seen 5 things, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I've seen 7 things, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and I've unified both of those concepts with my mind so that the concept of the summation of 7 and 5 being 12, I cannot find 12 in the unification of these by itself. And to be explicit, since we're talking about a priori propositions, specifically mathematical propositions, independent to experience, right? By definition now, right? Independent to experience, we cannot say that we have identified 7 and 5, the concept of 7 and 5 being unified in the concept of 12, right? Our intuition synthesizes, right? And he talks about this. Our intuition synthesizes 7 and 5 to create this concept of 12. So that 12 is, and I'm jumping the gun here, but 12 becomes the synthesis of our intuitive ability, if that makes sense, right? I'll leave it at that now. I don't want to flesh it out anymore. The statement needs a little bit more clarification. What does that mean? But as I said, you know, Kant's not the easiest read. So I'll come back to that and try and make a little further sense if you didn't catch the significance of that statement.